This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values. This week, I turn my mic over to a guest host for an interview with Dr. Zoë Roach about the growing field of systems biology. Zoë Gray is a math major honors student at Cal Poly. She has a background in electrical engineering and is particularly interested in considering the pace of technological development and the ethics of a system of technological production that moves so quickly. Dr. Zoë Roach, MD, PhD, is a senior research scientist at the Institute for Systems Biology. Starting as a graduate student in the 1990s, Dr. Roach worked on the Human Genome Project from its early days through to the end of the project. Dr. Roach contributed strategic and algorithmic design to the Human Genome Project, including the pairwise end sequencing strategy. He was a senior fellow at the Department of Molecular Biotechnology at the University of Washington from 1999 to 2000. In 2001, he became a research scientist at the Institute for Systems Biology. His group currently applies systems biology and genomics to complex diseases, focusing on the systems biology architecture of Alzheimer's disease.
Hi, Dr. Roach. How are you today?
Hi, Zoe. I'm good.
Well, I'd like to start off by asking you about your current research at the Institute for Systems Biology. What does it mean to take a systems biology approach to clinical trials, and how is this approach different from the current expected form of a clinical trial?
So I direct the Alzheimer's and dementia clinical trials for the Institute for Systems Biology. We have a partnership with Providence St. Joseph Health, which is one of the largest hospital systems in the United States. It has hospitals from Alaska to Texas, including a fair number in Washington and California. So ISB is in some ways a research organization, and it's paired with Providence St. Joseph Health, who historically has been a very clinically oriented hospital system. And so together we're able to combine our strengths and do innovative clinical trials. Providence is originally a Christian organization. It has nuns on its board of directors and is really interested in some of the sort of elements of Catholic faith in terms of delivering healthcare. So it wants to reach out to everyone, not just the privileged. It wants to reach out to people who are traditionally don't have access to healthcare, whether that's in rural areas or otherwise are don't maybe in they don't have a lot of money, right? And they don't have normal access to healthcare. So in that sense, we want to develop and discover and do research that will serve everybody on the planet eventually. And so one of the biggest medical problems that we face as human beings is dementia. A huge fraction of the world's population will go on at some point in their life and develop dementia and die with it and or of it. Alzheimer's disease is one form, is a particularly common form of dementia. And in addition to causing people to lose their memories, in many cases, is actually directly responsible for their deaths. It's also incredibly painful for people who have to care for Alzheimer's disease. So this is a disease not just of individuals who have the disease, but of all of their family and their caregivers and society. And it's very expensive. And so we've selected Alzheimer's disease as a particularly important problem to study with innovative new methods for learning that have become available really in the last few decades. A lot of things have been changing. You may have noticed over the last few decades, a lot of things in the world are changing rapidly. A lot of technologies are changing. Information science is changing. Computers are becoming more powerful. Artificial intelligence is becoming more powerful. Companies are leveraging information to increase their commerce opportunities. And so science too has opportunities to change and really advance and change the way we generate knowledge. Most of the scientific establishment has been doing science roughly the same way since the Renaissance. We have departments where we have professors and chairs and PhD students that are organized roughly the same way they were in the 17th century. And we think about knowledge using a lot of things that we learned in the 17th century, but for the most part, the area of medical knowledge is governed by the epistemology of the 20th century, when we invented statistics. So R.A. Fisher and others in the early 20th century came up with mathematical methods to quantify knowledge, things like p-values and effect sizes, sort of things. R.A. Fisher was an agricultural scientist in Britain. He was really interested in increasing crop yields and moving bull manure, how to figure out where to put the manure in fields and how much manure to fields, and measure everything. So statistics is rooted in bull manure. But it was really useful. And one of the reasons that statistics was so effective and popular for 20th century knowledge generation was because in the 19th century, medical knowledge had really gone off the tracks. In fact, to be honest with you, it's probably been off the tracks since the dawn of humanity in many ways. But this concept of snake oil and snake oil salesman was sort of a 19th century concept where almost anybody could say almost anything they wanted about medicine, and people might believe it. It'd be advertised. People would take all kinds of medicines, and not necessarily for their benefit. My grandfather was a family practice doctor in upstate New York, and he treated people in his house. He has a little office in the front room. I could still root around and find old things, but he would shine UV lights on people to give them, I'm sure, horrible sunburns to treat something. And some of his medicines were arsenic to treat, I'm not quite sure what. And so there was really a need in the 20th century to change the way we think about medicine. That really took off, in part because also early in the 20th century, the chemical industry also took off, starting in Germany with the ability to synthesize new chemicals. The pairing of medical science and chemical synthesis led to the development of the pharmaceutical industry. And so we then needed to be able, and we were able to apply medicine and statistics to all these new pharmaceuticals to come up with wonder drugs. Things like antibiotics, things like cancer chemotherapeutics. Almost every successful drug that you could think of off the top of your head came from this marriage of statistics and chemistry. Organizations like the FDA in the United States developed to help regulate and control this industry. And what's happened, as wonderful as all of this drug development has been, is it's locked the whole system into a particular way of doing things that was innovative in 1910 and is now straitjacketing all of research. And it's, as a result, even as these other industries like information science and commerce have advanced tremendously, biomedical science has not grabbed hold of new ways of doing science yet, at least not in general. There's plenty of areas of light. I hope the Institute for Systems Biology is one. In Alzheimer's disease in particular, we have suffered from this straitjacketing, in part because also around the time of 1900 or so, this guy named Ewa Alzheimer, who also borrowed a little bit of credit from another guy named Oscar Fisker, but Ewa Alzheimer, to get his name on the disease, took advantage of these new chemicals, these dyes, in this case, dyes, not pharmaceuticals, to stain the brains of people who had recently died and discovered plaques in their brains and named this disease that we now know as Alzheimer's based on these diseases. Because of what Ewa Alzheimer did, as well as others, it was thought that these amyloid plaques, the amyloid being the chemical in his brains, caused Alzheimer's disease. And that hypothesis ruled all of Alzheimer's disease research for 100 years, until about 10 years ago. And it was thought that all you had to do was go to one of these pharmaceutical companies, come up with a drug that removed the Alzheimer's plaques the amyloid plaques from your brains, and you'd cure Alzheimer's disease. The wonderful thing about being an experimentalist is you have a hypothesis that if you remove the amyloid plaques from people's brains, it should cure Alzheimer's disease. You would wait to test that, or get a drug that does that, which is amazing in itself. And I find it absolutely mind-boggling that we were actually able to come up with a drug to do that, but we did, and it was an absolute disaster. Pharmaceutical companies have come up with several drugs now. You remove the amyloid from people's brains, they get brain bleeds, they end up worse off, their cognition probably doesn't improve much. But because we tried and failed 10 years ago, and we continue to fail using that approach, it's now really opened the minds up of everyone in the field, including myself, that, wow, maybe there are multiple causes of Alzheimer's disease. Maybe amyloid's not the main problem. Maybe different people need different therapies. Maybe different people have different reasons for having dementia. Even people with diagnosis of Alzheimer's, not everyone with Alzheimer's necessarily has Alzheimer's for the same reason. So you have a complex disease. Maybe the answer to treating it is not a single drug. Maybe it's not even something from the pharmaceutical industry. To treat a complex disease, you might need a complex multimodal therapy. And maybe that therapy is a collection of things that might not be surprising. They might be sort of what you might call common sense, like exercise more, change your diet, stimulate your brain, and maybe also take some drugs too, if it's appropriate. Improve your general health. If you have diabetes, cure your diabetes. If you have hypertension, work on that. More generally speaking, let's really look at you as an individual, personalize your therapy, and give you a complex intervention as opposed to simple intervention. Of course, if I put my 20th century statistical hat on, I'd say you can't do that. That's not the way science is done. There's no simple statistical test I can do. If you do your experiment, I'll be so confused. I don't know what to do a p-value on. There's too much knowledge, too much information. I can't analyze it. And so in addition to coming up with these new hypotheses, I have to use new tools to generate new knowledge. And the good news is a lot of things that used to be almost impossible to imagine have now become fairly routine. I can get lots of data fairly quickly. I can sequence someone's genome. I can measure all of the proteins and the metabolites in their blood. I can scan their brain. I can generate all kinds of data. I can have them wear a little ring that tells me what their heart rate is and how much exercise they're getting. I could get all kinds of continuous data. So I can get a vast amount of data, and I can analyze it in a way that's more comprehensive, more mechanistic, to try to understand the causality of connections in a person and diagnose what's going on with them, and then maybe how to treat them and get them better. For someone who's not a biomedical scientist, this is obviously the way you generate knowledge. Like if you take your car to the car mechanic doesn't say, oh, it's not stopping as quickly as you'd like. Well, I've done some statistics, and 70% of the time, the problem is your brake pads. So I'm going to replace your brake pads and send you on your way. I don't want a statistical answer. I want you to diagnose exactly what's going on with my car, because maybe it's not my brake pads. Maybe I need to add the brake fluid and do some other things as well. So I want you to understand what's causing things to happen in my car rather than just use this phenomenology. There's a problem with this approach, practically speaking. People won't fund it because it's not the way people do things. It's hard to get things published because the establishment says, well, that's not the way people do things, and so on. And yet we are. This is what we try to do is push around the edges and innovate. And so it's taken me a long time to answer your question, but that gives you a sense of what we're up to.
Yeah, you've kind of in a way described what systems biology is. So from that, I want to build on perhaps what you find to be most valuable and promising in systems biology for the future.
I think it is not necessarily the specifics of what we're doing. It's not the fact that I am doing a specific clinical trial to test a set of interventions for, say, Alzheimer's disease. The most valuable thing we're doing is reinventing the way that we're generating knowledge in science, or at least rediscovering it. Some people would argue that some of the 19th century philosophers, natural philosophers, like Humboldt, for example, used many of these methods, and Darwin. They generated a lot of data insofar as they could and tried to develop mechanistic hypotheses. They had much more limited data sets. They didn't have computers and artificial intelligence, but they had a much broader sense of epistemology than where we ended up in the 20th century. And so what I have to do is take all of these new modern approaches to generating data and analyzing data, build on statistics for sure, use statistics. So I don't want to end up back in the trap of the snake oil salesman where I'm kind of waving my hands and saying, trust me. And I think the way to do that is mechanistic models. If you can understand why A leads to B leads to C to D, and in some cases it's not linear, right? Because we have very complex systems. But if I can explain why things are happening, I don't necessarily need to use statistics. And so I can explain complex phenomena using systems biology.
So you just mentioned that you may not need to use statistics. So are there any difficulties or problems that arise when working with so much data, or is there like a clear path forward?
There's no single clear path forward, and there's many paths forward. That's one of the beauties of being in information science and knowledge generation today. There's lots of things you can do with big data. A lot of the limitations that had been around a decade ago are starting to fall away. Like, for example, for a while, there was some issues with, can you store all the data? Can you find a hard drive big enough to store that? We're not really having a problem storing data. Increasingly, the amount of processing power that's available to science for the kinds of computer problems we're using is no longer limiting. In some cases, for some of the biggest AI problems, you need to have a fairly big budget, but for the most of what we do, I do a lot of my computing on my laptop. So generating the data is still not super cheap. It takes billions of dollars for big pharma to bring a drug to market. And so compared to that, we spend millions of dollars on our trial, but that's still fairly expensive. So we're still at a point where it's just, you can't necessarily do a lot of the research we do in your garage, although you can do mini versions of it. Clearly, some of the things we're doing in terms of the actual algorithms, how do you build knowledge from data, in many cases is still in its infancy, but there's a lot of work from a lot of researchers on things like causality inference and systems biology. It's what I've been doing for a few decades, is building our paths forward.
I think the average listener is most likely familiar with the collection and usage of our personal data by advertisers and other corporations via the internet, which on its own has its own ethical consequences, but also benefits. Do you envision a future where biodata collection and applications go beyond the sphere of research and become the norm?
Probably. Can I do a footnote real quick? I remember.
Yeah, of course.
You clarified one of the things I said, and I did say it, about not using statistics. I just so I don't get
No, you're good.
The soundbite. I totally use lots of statistics in my research. I don't use exclusively statistical methods. I use lots of other methods. So is it possible we end up in a future where, say, everybody goes around with everything about them, their biological state, sort of known to everybody else and known to the government and advertisers and that sort of thing? I don't know. I kind of hope not. I'm kind of a private person. I don't generally like people to know my social security number, for example. I'm always flabbergasted that people will ask for my birth date, routinely, as some sort of password or code or something. I'm like, no, I didn't tell you my birth date. That said, it's clear that a lot of the world is moving in a direction where both consumers and companies and governments tend to either shrug or look the other way or treat these things as the norm of information sharing. So I think it's plausible that as we generate certain types of information and it becomes available, that some of these entities will, I guess it's somewhat reassuring that for the most part, people's medical information does seem to be kind of sacrosanct. I mean, most your hospitals generally don't share, your medical records with anyone other than you or other people that need to know them. Although there's plenty of loopholes, like your insurance company probably knows a lot more of what's going on with your medical record than you would like them to know, for example. And what if there's data breaches? I made a prediction in 2010. This is shortly after we sequenced the first full genome of a human family. So it was very heady at the time to have been involved in that. I was just flabbergasted that technology had advanced so fast. I had been involved with the original Human Genome Project back in 2000-ish, the 90s and 2000. And at the time, felt like I was sort of like a ground controller for like the Apollo mission. Like, it was really cool that I was part of it. You put this person on the moon, but you're never going to the moon yourself, right? So I helped sequence the first version of the human genome. And I was like, well, I'll never have my genome sequenced. And then 10 years later, I'm involved with sequencing for tens of thousands of dollars, peanuts at the time. I mean, comparatively, a whole family. And less than 10 years later, I have my own genome sequenced, and you guys could get your own genome sequenced for less than $1,000 or so if you wanted to as well. So that's an amazing change in pace of technology. But so I made the prediction in 2010 that by 2012, somebody would figure out how to get a sample from the presidential candidates, and the presidential candidates' genomes would be all over the place, and people would be arguing about, oh, you don't want to elect so and so because their gene is X or Y or Z or that sort of thing. And it hasn't happened yet. So it's sort of interesting. I'm not quite sure why. You'd think that there's plenty of weird people involved in politics who will stop at nothing, right? You've seen that. And so why hasn't, one of these characters, with their black top hats, gone around and secretly gotten some DNA sample and done that? I'm not sure. So I think we will see these kinds of people steal biological and genetic information, put it out there. Hopefully society will respond in sort of severe ways and say, we don't want that.
Yeah, no, I suppose that a lot of new technology opens many possibilities, and that doesn't mean they're all going to happen. Is there anything from your position of expertise where you can definitively say or suggest any steps we can take to prevent certain futures from happening?
Nope. This gets kind of general away from biology, but I'm a big fan of, this is for, if somebody's listening to this 10 years from now, we're talking right now as Russia is invading Ukraine, right? And so we're thinking a lot about the value of liberal democracies and what they bring to humanity and their ability to create and enable ethics to be applied to our societies. And so I think the best thing we can do is maintain our liberal democracies and maintain active discourse where we're listening to every element of our society, right? When you don't allow segments of your society vote, like, so for example, if you go back 100 years and even now in some places, if you suppress the ability of mothers and women to vote, right, you're losing a powerful and important aspect of ethics and humanity. And that would apply if you're suppressing any votes. You're not listening to voices. And so active continued discourse is, I think, the most important thing in terms of preventing things, right? You can never, any number of philosophers and political activists, that you can never stop, right? You have to, constant vigilance is required. Your question, though, it may be more general. What are there things this particular field can do to prevent abuses of medical information? A lot of that stuff is going on, right? We've created these ethics boards that review all research, and that's been something that we're constantly improving, but that's something that's fairly new. At least the depth and scope of how they're being used is only decades old, and in response to some of the abuses of research that were done in the mid to late 20th century, both by entities that we think of as horrid, like Nazi research, but also to a lot of the research that went on even in the United States by the US government. So having ethics boards, involved in research, thinking about how we want our federal government to respond to what laws we want them to create with healthcare information. I think all those things are very important. This is against the backdrop where there might be someone or a voice or maybe at least in theory you could say, well, maybe we should stop all scientific research or never generate data on people because it could be used for harm. I think that the answer to that question for a lot of biomedical data is that the benefit from understanding how our bodies work and improving our health care, improving our well-being, right? Not just not getting sick, but living longer, living more healthily, not losing our minds, is quite valuable. And certainly to me, in my mind, and almost everyone I talk to, they're like, yes, we do want to be healthy. We don't want disease. And so there's a bit of potentially, if there are downsides to having medical information, my general sense is the upsides are considerably greater.
And now I'd like to take it back to when you're discussing having the importance of having an open discourse among society about these new technological issues. And I wanted to open it up to how science fiction is used as a method of generating this discourse. And, talking about this genetic research, more bio-focused, it brought my mind to Gattaca, and the societal impact, cultural impact that movie had. And for people who are not familiar with Gattaca or need to brush up on what happens, this movie is set in the not too distant future, where a database of humans' biometric data is used to categorize humans as valids or invalids. Valids have genetically modified before birth, while invalids have been born naturally. In this world, genetic discrimination is illegal, but in practice, genotype profiling is used to identify valids to qualify for professional employment, while invalids are relegated to menial jobs. How realistic is Gattaca, or is science fiction like Gattaca helpful or harmful to this discourse?
I love science fiction. I really like Frank Herbert's Dune, books and obviously the movies. And that too has an element of genetic modification in it. There's this scheme by the Bene Gesserit to, over thousands of years, to breed, a superhuman being, sort of this eugenics, taken to a bit of an extreme. So there's lots of value in creating art, whether it's a movie or a book or sculpture, and having that help us stretch our imaginations and stimulate discourse. Absolutely. One of the neat things about poetry, or movies for that matter, is I think different people see different things in it. Just for what it's worth, when I watch Gattaca, I see it as a metaphor for all discrimination, right? Because as you've described it, it uses genetics as a vehicle to create two classes, right? The valids and invalids, and then for some arbitrary purpose, the valids get more benefit from society. So when I see that, I think about, okay, that's a metaphor for Black Lives Matter. That's a metaphor for women not earning as much as men. For all of the forms of discrimination, Gattaca's talking about that. Gattaca's answer to it is kind of interesting. Gattaca's answer to how to solve discrimination in that particular movie is to put the burden on the individual who's discriminated against, right? The protagonist of that story feels the need to be smarter than everybody around him, to try harder, to strive hard. And he eventually, through his personal effort, succeeds in going to the stars. It's very kind of Ayn Rand, sort of the individual conquers everything and that's wonderful, right? It's a great story for all of us who want to succeed against the forces that are pushing against us. And I'm all in favor of personal advancement. People who are dealing with discrimination would argue, particularly some of these systemic issues, would say it's not just the person who's being discriminated against has some responsibility to deal with the system, but really you want to modify the system as a whole. So for me, that movie, when people say, how should Gattaca inform ethics? I say, we have some pretty big discrimination issues in society. And the least of maybe not the least, but well down the list, after you check off gender and race and ethics and so on, you get to genetic discrimination. So let's definitely work on these big, huge discrimination problems. Well, we're also thinking about not having to deal with genetic discrimination. Could we have genetic discrimination? I think it's plausible, right? Let's say that we have, particularly like imagine you've got some sort of totalitarian government, right, that hates Jewish people. It could say, wow, we're going to sequence everyone's genome. It's mandatory. We'll shoot you if you don't give us some blood and sequence your genome. And anyone who's got a genetic signature of having been an Ashkenazi Jew and those genetic signatures exist, we'll just shoot you too. We saw Nazis do similar things. They didn't sequence your genome, but so I think we live in unfortunately, there are humans that might do things like that. I guess it's a risk, right? Along with all the other forms of discrimination we have. I think, again, this is the sort of thing you've got to control at the society level, right? It'd be very hard to put the cat back in the box or the genie back in the bottle, whatever the right metaphor is, of saying we're not going to learn how to sequence people's genomes because it could lead to discrimination. We've already done that. We've got that knowledge. And again, I think the value of sequencing people's genomes, because it gives us such tremendous power to help people with genetic disease, and there's many other wonderful things that come out of being able to sequence genomes. It's not the sort of thing where you say, let's not learn this information, but let's learn how to deal with it in a responsible way.
What are the ethical implications of having the ability to diagnose diseases that we don't have cures for? Or potentially telling someone, like, there's a chance you'll have this disease, but we don't really know for certain?
So those are two very different questions.
Okay, yeah.
Take the first question. I think it's interesting because that's what I was taught in the 20. I went to medical school in the 20th century. I'm that old. And I was taught, this ethic of, don't test for something that you can't treat, whether it was a genetic test or any test. I shouldn't try. If I can't treat something, there's no reason to learn about it or tell somebody the risk of it, because there's nothing you can do. And that, I think, may have been true in the 20th century. And I think it's no longer true. There's no such thing in the 21st century of a disease that we can do nothing about, right? Because, I met a young high school student a few years ago who was doing a project along these lines. And I was talking with her and saying, well, you're learning about these diseases, but, what if you learn that you have a disease that you can't treat? And she looked at me and said, well, then I'll devote my life to curing it. And I was like, okay, well, we live in a world where that's plausible, right? It's not like, oh, that's impossible. You can't possibly learn how to treat it. I'm totally aware, using systems biology and the other tools, you got 100 years of life or 60 or 70 or 80 or how many of ahead of you. There's no longer any such thing as a disease you can't do anything about, right? And if you yourself don't want to go and become a researcher, there's any number of ways you can advance science, right? You can support it politically, you can support it economically. And so I don't really have a problem anymore with learning about diseases, even if there's no current therapy. And furthermore, I'm actually beginning to believe that there's almost always some things that you can do. And some of them seem simple and obvious, but it's amazing how effective things like eliminating sugar from your diet is, and how effective that is for so many diseases, right? Just getting more healthy in general. And so even though we're used to thinking in terms of magic pills from the pharmaceutical companies that cure things, I think the future is not just going to be about magic pills, and it's also going to be about learning about diseases and personalizing things. So I think the future is very bright. Now, the second question you asked was, what about probabilities, right? Let's say I don't have this perfect knowledge of some particular disease or medicine, which is true in so many cases. Alzheimer's disease is a great case where we know quite a bit about the disease, but still everything's kind of vague and uncertain. And so let's say that I know enough to tell somebody they got a 10% chance of getting Alzheimer's disease or something, right? Should I tell that person? And again, if I think about personalizing medicine, right? So if we talked earlier about how everybody who has Alzheimer's might have it for a slightly different reason, and they might need slightly different therapies to help them with either to prevent it or cure or ameliorate their Alzheimer's disease. The same is true with information. There's some people who totally want to know they have a 10% chance of Alzheimer's. Other people who totally don't want to know. And there's also, it's not just whether people want to know or don't want to know. Different people have different understandings of how they receive information in math, right? There's plenty of people out there that don't really have a good understanding of what 10% means, right? Or how to use it, right? And so how do you communicate probabilistic information is something that we face in a lot of fields of science and actually elsewhere in society. And I think it needs to be personalized. You see that a lot in weather reporting. You don't see a lot of weather reports where they give you the exact percent of rain, but you can find them, like on Weather Underground, I think you can. But most weather reports will say there's a slight chance of rain tomorrow or whatever. And so the short answer to the probabilistic information is, there's not a one size fits all. You really have to think about who you're communicating with and how they respond to it. You'll even run into people like, let's say you're going to go hiking in the mountains, and you say, 1 out of a million people get struck by lightning. They're hiking in the mountains, and now all they can think about for the whole hike is the fact they might get struck by lightning, right? So they're perseverating on this really remote chance that they actually, the risk of getting a car crash was far greater driving to the hike. But now you're dealing with someone who just can't stop thinking about that. And so clearly, that person is not someone you're also going to want to say, oh, and by the way, you have a 2% chance of getting Alzheimer's disease. So I don't know if there's the correct answer is to personalize everything. The other answer that's related to that is to have decent societal norms to start with, right? Because you might want to say, well, in general, most people in our society don't want to know if they have a less than a 2% chance of getting some sort of disease. They don't want to just think about that. And so if that's sort of your societal norm, you might start by saying, in general, we're not going to share that with you. unless you come to me and say, look, I really want to know this information, then I think you should share it. I'm not a big fan of paternalistic laws where the law might say, you as a doctor may not share this particular type of information with your patient under any circumstances. Generally speaking, I think people have the right to know information if they want that information.
You mentioned personalizing healthcare. Have you seen this people starting to apply personalized healthcare, and how is this changing medicine?
Yeah, I think it's already become standard for a number of areas of medicine, almost so standard that we don't necessarily think about as personalization, but a couple of like think about hypertension is one of the major things that the major health issues that we face as a nation and a world right now. We understand a lot about the different causes of hypertension from a molecular and a physiological method. And when somebody comes to us with hypertension, we know we need to treat it in almost all cases, and that people will be more healthy if we treat it. And generally speaking, we personalize that therapy for hypertension. So we might say, why don't you start off by working on some diet, and I'll give you this particular medicine. We'll see how it goes. And I might start somebody else with a different approach. I might have them do more exercise and different medicine. And of course, part of personalization is we see how it goes, right? And we measure maybe what's going on with your blood and your hypertension over time, and then we tweak the therapy. And so it ends up being sort of a personalized, we'll find the best fit for you to control your hypertension. We do the same thing for people with diabetes to control their blood sugars. We do similar things for people with high cholesterol. And so personalized medicine has already been here, either by that name or by other names. So generally speaking, I think it is a great way to do medicine. So just like personalize it, just like understanding what's wrong with your car is a great way to fix your car.
What are some ethical consequences of the mass collection of biodata we could see arise in the near future? Or are there any?
Well, I mean, this is going off on a limb a little bit, but technology advances so fast, sometimes going off on a limb ends up being what happens 3 years in the future. I don't follow this field terribly closely, but there's the really advanced artificial intelligence that people are developing, where if you're Microsoft or other big entities that have lots and lots of computers, you can put together, multi-million-dollar clusters of computers that can start pulling information out of big data sets that rival the kind of insights that humans can do. And so it might not be very long before these machines are, I'm not quite sure how you define smart, but smarter than us, that I can give one of these big, huge clusters of machines massive amounts of bio data. Is that the term of art you're using? And it might generate new insights. It might figure out a cause of Alzheimer's disease that I haven't imagined, right? And some of those insights might surprise us or disturb us, right? Because you end up with thinking in brand new ways. I play this game called Go. It's this Asian game, Go in Japan. And very recently, some of these artificial intelligence programs became better at playing Go than the best human players. And they would play moves that us human players were like, wow, we wouldn't have played that move. I wonder why it's playing that move. And to some extent, we still don't fully understand why the machines are playing these moves that are clearly better than ours. And so I guess the question is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's clear. I mean, it's pretty easy to see why it might be good, right? It'd be pretty cool if this machine could figure out the cause of Alzheimer's disease when we couldn't. Do we really want machines that are smarter than us? Are there downsides? I haven't fully thought that one out yet. It may actually be something that we don't have a lot of control over. That might just be something that just happens because of the way our society is built.
Yeah, that definitely poses a really interesting question, especially when we have things that could be more intelligent than us, giving us information that almost we can't work with, just that we have to take as fact, and questioning whether we really want that information or not if we aren't able to act on it.
So I guess, one place you haven't gone in is genetic modification, right? That's often part of these conversations. We talked a little bit about Gattaca and where somebody might use genetic information to discriminate against somebody. But what happens when we actually have the ability to edit our own genomes, change the nature of who we are? I mean, if I'm worried about what happens when we make machines that are smarter than us, what happens when we make other humans that are smarter than us? Or if we could make them, what should we? And if somebody else makes them, how should we respond? It's seeming like those sorts of things are possible. We already have gene therapy, which I'm a big fan of, right? If somebody is born with sickle cell anemia, this horrible disease, and I can change their somatic genes that they're not going to pass on to their children, so that I cure their sickle cell anemia and they live a wonderful life instead of a miserable life. I'm all in favor of that, right? And we've got some examples where we've done exactly that in science. But you say, okay, well, that's clearly good. I can't really find any downsides to that. But what about the slippery slope of, well, what if they want to have kids? Should I allow them to change their genes so that their kids don't have sickle cell anemia? I'm not sure. You could talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And then you run into people that said, well, I want to edit I'm going to use in vitro fertilization, but I want to edit my kids' genomes and make sure they have blonde hair or whatever. Or by the way, can you make them so they have more muscles, or that maybe even they're smarter, right? Where can we go? The more understanding we have of genetics, the more people can tinker with these things. And then you have a whole bunch. Now, clearly, we're not going to get into that today, but there's lots of scope for ethical discussion of what should we do, what should we allow, what should we be thinking of with the capability of editing our germline, because it's clearly out there, this possibility.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Roach.
Sure thing. It's been a pleasure talking with you.